Picture this: a single peninsula on the edge of Europe would conquer and control territories spanning 4 continents, ruling over lands from Alaska to Argentina, from the Philippines to Florida. For over 400 years, the Spanish Empire became the first truly global empire in human history, where quite literally the sun never set on Spanish territory. The Spanish Empire fundamentally shaped the modern world in ways we still experience today. Spanish became the second most spoken language on earth. Catholicism spread across entire continents. The first global economy emerged, connected by Spanish silver and trade routes. Cities like Mexico City, Lima, and Manila became cosmopolitan centers, rivaling Madrid and Paris. But this empire's story is also one of staggering contradictions. Unparalleled wealth built on human suffering. Cultural achievements alongside devastating destruction. Religious missions intertwined with brutal conquest. The Spanish created universities, hospitals, and magnificent architecture, while simultaneously enslaving millions and destroying entire civilizations. From humble beginnings, as fractured medieval kingdoms fighting Muslim rulers, Spain rose to become the dominant global superpower, only to gradually fade back to its European origins. The empire that once controlled 13% of the world's land surface left an indelible mark on world history, creating the cultural DNA of modern Latin America and establishing patterns of globalization that continue today. So let's start today's story. Get comfortable, adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket. Trust me, once we begin this epic journey through 4 centuries of triumph and tragedy, conquest and loss, you won't want to move. Close your eyes and let me take you back to a time when Spain was about to change the world forever. You wake up on the 19th of October, 1469, in the Cathedral of Valladolid, watching history unfold before your eyes. A young woman of 18, Isabel of Castile, stands beside Ferdinand of Aragon, just 17, as they exchange marriage vows. The crowd around you buzzes with excitement and uncertainty. Few realize they're witnessing the birth of what will become the most powerful empire the world has ever known. Your peninsula is a patchwork of competing kingdoms. Castile, the largest, stretches across central Spain, but struggles with internal conflicts and weak leadership. Aragon controls the eastern coast and has strong Mediterranean connections through its territories in Sicily and Sardinia. To the south, the Kingdom of Granada remains the last Muslim stronghold in Western Europe, a remnant of the once mighty Al-Andalus that had ruled most of Iberia for centuries. The marriage between Isabel and Ferdinand isn't just romantic, it's revolutionary. Their kingdoms remain legally separate, but they rule jointly, combining Castile's vast interior territories with Aragon's maritime experience and international connections. You watch as they begin consolidating power, crushing rebellious nobles who had grown too powerful during previous weak reigns. But your rulers face enormous challenges. The royal treasury is nearly empty. Bandits control major highways, making trade dangerous. The nobility refuses to pay taxes. Different regions speak different languages and follow different laws. Most challenging of all, the Kingdom of Granada continues to exist as an independent Muslim state, a constant reminder that the Christian reconquest of Iberia remains incomplete. Isabel and Ferdinand, however, possess something their predecessors lacked: ruthless determination combined with political genius. They establish the Holy Brotherhood, a royal police force that begins pacifying the countryside and protecting merchants. They reform the military, creating a professional army loyal to the crown rather than individual nobles. Most importantly, they begin asserting royal authority over the powerful Catholic Church in Spain. In 1478, they establish the Spanish Inquisition, not just as a religious institution, but as a tool of political control. Under the fanatical leadership of Toms de Torquemada, the Inquisition becomes an instrument for creating religious and political unity. Conversos Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity face constant suspicion and persecution. The Inquisition's tribunals spread fear throughout your kingdoms, but they also create the religious uniformity that Isabel and Ferdinand believed necessary for strong rule. You witness the systematic preparation for what everyone knows must come: the final war against Granada. Your monarchs negotiate truces with France and Portugal, securing their borders. They reform taxation, gradually filling the royal treasury. They cultivate relationships with Italian bankers who can provide credit for military campaigns. Every decision seems calculated toward one ultimate goal. The transformation of your peninsula during these early years is remarkable. Where once chaos reigned, order gradually emerges. Roads become safer, trade increases. The various kingdoms begin feeling like parts of a unified whole. Isabel and Ferdinand aren't just ruling. They're creating a unified Spanish identity that transcends regional differences. As you drift off to sleep in this world of emerging Spanish power, you have no idea that within 2 decades, your unified kingdoms will launch expeditions that will discover new continents, conquer vast empires, and establish the first truly global colonial system. The marriage you witnessed in Valladolid was just the first step in an incredible journey from regional power to world empire. You wake to the thunder of cannons echoing across the Vega of Granada on the 2nd of January, 1492. After 10 years of intermittent warfare, the final act of the Reconquista is about to unfold. You stand among the Christian forces watching as Boabdil, the last Muslim king of Granada, prepares to surrender the keys to his magnificent city. 8 centuries of Islamic rule in Iberia are about to end. The siege has been brutal and methodical. Isabel and Ferdinand have demonstrated the same systematic approach that characterizes all their endeavors. Rather than risking costly assaults against Granada's powerful fortifications, they've built the town of Santa Fe nearby and settled in for a war of attrition. Their artillery, some of the most advanced in Europe, has pounded the walls relentlessly. Inside Granada, you can imagine the desperation. Food supplies have dwindled to nothing. The population is starving. Boabdil, caught between his own people's suffering and the impossible demands of the Christian monarchs, finally accepts that further resistance is futile. The terms of surrender are relatively generous. Muslims can stay, practice their religion, and keep their property, provided they accept Christian rule. As Boabdil hands over the keys to the city, legend says he looks back one last time at the Alhambra, tears streaming down his face. His mother, Exa, reportedly tells him, "You do well to weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." Whether true or not, the story captures the magnitude of this moment. The last independent Muslim state in Western Europe has fallen, but you witness something even more significant than military conquest. Isabel and Ferdinand use this victory to make a profound statement about the nature of their rule. They're not just kings and queens, they're Catholic monarchs, divinely appointed to spread Christian faith and create religious unity. The fall of Granada isn't just political, it's the culmination of a holy war. Within months, your rulers make an even more dramatic decision. On the 31st of March, 1492, they signed the Alhambra Decree, ordering all Jews in their kingdoms to either convert to Christianity or leave within 4 months. This affects some 200,000 people, many whose families have lived in Iberia for over a millennium. The economic consequences are severe. Jews have been prominent in commerce, medicine, and scholarship. But Isabel and Ferdinand prioritize religious uniformity over economic considerations. The expulsion is carried out with systematic efficiency that foreshadows later imperial policies. Jewish property is confiscated or sold at below market prices. Families are torn apart as some convert while others choose exile. Ancient communities are destroyed overnight. Those who leave carry tales of Spanish persecution throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, creating lasting enmity toward your emerging empire. Yet even as this human tragedy unfolds, another expedition is preparing that will change world history. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator who has spent years trying to convince European monarchs to fund his westward voyage, finally receives backing from Isabel and Ferdinand. Fresh from their Granada victory and flush with confiscated Jewish wealth, your monarchs are willing to gamble on Columbus's theory that he can reach Asia by sailing west. On the 3rd of August, 1492, you watch from the docks of Palos as Columbus departs with 3 small ships, the Nia, the Pinta, and the Santa Mara. The 90 men aboard have no idea they're about to accidentally discover continents that will transform Spain from a regional European power into the wealthiest empire on earth. The convergence of these events, the fall of Granada, the expulsion of the Jews, and Columbus's departure, creates a unique historical moment. Your monarchs have achieved their primary domestic goals: territorial unity, religious uniformity, and centralized royal authority. Now they're ready to project Spanish power beyond the peninsula. The foundations of empire are complete. As you sleep in this transformed Spain, religious processions celebrating the reconquest echo through streets where Arabic had been spoken for centuries. The Spain that will conquer the Americas has been forged in the crucible of religious war and cultural elimination. The methods that succeeded in Granada: systematic preparation, religious justification, and ruthless execution will soon be applied on a global scale. You wake on the 12th of October, 1492, aboard the Santa Mara, watching Columbus kneel on the beach of San Salvador as he claims this unknown land for the Spanish crown. The Tano people who inhabit this island stare in wonder at your ships, having never seen European technology or horses. They offer gifts of cotton, parrots, and small amounts of gold. Columbus, convinced he's reached the Indies, calls them Indians, a mistake that will persist for centuries. What you're witnessing is the accidental discovery that will transform Spain into the world's first global superpower. Columbus has no idea he's found continents unknown to Europe. He believes these islands are off the coast of Asia, that China and Japan lie just beyond the horizon. This fundamental misunderstanding will drive Spanish exploration for decades to come. The return voyage to Spain is triumphant. You arrive in Barcelona in April 1493, where Isabel and Ferdinand receive Columbus like a conquering hero. The exotic birds, strange plants, and Tano captives he presents create a sensation at court. More importantly, the small amounts of gold he's brought suggest vast riches await discovery. Your monarchs immediately petition Pope Alexander VI for exclusive rights to these new lands. The papal bull Inter Caetera, issued in May 1493, divides the unknown world between Spain and Portugal along a north-south line. This document, signed by a Spanish pope, essentially gives your nation legal claim to most of the Americas. The Treaty of Tordesillas with Portugal the following year adjusts this line slightly westward. inadvertently giving Portugal claim to what will become Brazil. But the second voyage, departing in September 1493, with 17 ships and over 1,000 men, reveals the harsh realities of New World colonization. You witness the establishment of La Isabela, the first permanent European settlement in the Americas. Disease ravages both Spanish colonists and indigenous populations. The promised gold proves scarce. Tensions between Spanish settlers and Tano people escalate into warfare and enslavement. Columbus, despite his navigational genius, proves to be a terrible colonial administrator. His harsh treatment of both Spanish colonists and indigenous peoples creates constant rebellions. The island of Hispaniola becomes a laboratory for colonial exploitation that will be replicated throughout the Americas. Tano people are forced into encomienda labor systems that amount to slavery. Their population, perhaps 400,000 when Columbus arrived, collapses to fewer than 60,000 within 2 decades. Yet the Spanish colonial enterprise expands relentlessly. You watch as new expeditions probe the Caribbean, establishing settlements on Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and Cuba. Each island becomes a base for further exploration and a source of enslaved indigenous labor. The Spanish developed techniques of conquest and control that will serve them well when they encounter larger, more complex civilizations on the mainland. The early colonial economy depends on gold mining, but the real wealth comes from enslaving indigenous people and appropriating their lands. Spanish colonists establish cattle ranches and sugar plantations worked by forced indigenous labor. When disease devastates native populations, Portuguese traders begin importing enslaved Africans to replace them, establishing the horrific Atlantic slave trade that will transport millions of people across the ocean. By 1510, Spanish settlements have been established along the Caribbean coast of South America and Central America. You witness the founding of Panama City, which becomes the crucial link between Pacific and Atlantic trade. Spanish expeditions, always searching for gold and the passage to Asia, probe deeper into the mainland with each passing year. The Spanish crown, initially disappointed by the limited wealth from the Caribbean, gradually recognizes the strategic importance of these new territories. They provide bases for further exploration, sources of labor and resources, and, most importantly, stepping stones to the vast continental empires that await discovery. Royal officials replace Columbus and other early adventurers, establishing more systematic colonial administration. The encomienda system becomes the foundation of Spanish colonial labor relations. Spanish colonists receive grants of indigenous communities, supposedly to protect and Christianize them, but in reality to exploit their labor. This system allows relatively few Spanish settlers to control vast territories and large populations, a pattern that will be replicated throughout the Spanish Empire. As you drift to sleep in this rapidly expanding Caribbean empire, Spanish ships are already probing the coasts of Mexico and Central America. The accidental discovery of 1,492 has become systematic exploration and colonization. The techniques of control developed in the Caribbean combining military force, religious justification, and economic exploitation are about to be applied to civilizations far more complex and wealthy than anything yet encountered. The stage is set for the most audacious conquests in human history, as a few hundred Spanish adventurers prepare to topple empires commanding millions of subjects and vast treasuries of gold and silver. You wake on the coast of Mexico in February 1519, watching Hernan Cortes stride up the beach with just 600 men, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons. The audacity of what he's contemplating is breathtaking, conquering an empire of millions with a force smaller than a modern city neighborhood. But Quartz possesses advantages beyond mere weapons. Political genius, ruthless determination, and incredible luck. The Aztec Empire that awaits you is one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. Tenochtitlan, built on an island in Lake Texcoco, houses over 200,000 people, making it larger than any European city except Constantinople. Magnificent pyramids and palaces rise from carefully engineered canals and floating gardens. The Emperor Moctezuma II rules over millions of subjects from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific Ocean. But you quickly discover that this vast empire has crucial weaknesses. Many subject peoples, like the Tlaxcalans, resent Aztec domination and the constant demand for tribute and prisoners for human sacrifice. When Quartz arrives, he presents himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror, skillfully exploiting these divisions to build a coalition of indigenous allies. The role of Malintzin, known to the Spanish as Dua Marina, proves crucial to your expedition's success. This indigenous woman, given to Quartz as a slave, speaks both Mayan and Nahuatl, enabling communication with diverse groups. Her intelligence and diplomatic skills help Quartz navigate the complex political landscape of central Mexico. She becomes both translator and cultural interpreter, making the conquest possible through her intimate knowledge of indigenous societies. Your march inland resembles a diplomatic mission as much as a military expedition. In Tlaxcala, after fierce initial fighting, Quartz negotiates an alliance that provides thousands of indigenous warriors. These allies prove indispensable. They know the terrain, understand local customs, and share your goal of overthrowing Aztec dominance. Without them, the conquest would be impossible. The first sight of Tenochtitlan fills you with awe and terror. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of your companions, will later write that it seemed like something from a fairy tale. The massive pyramids, the orderly canals, the floating gardens, the bustling markets. Everything demonstrates a level of urban sophistication that rivals anything in Europe. Yet you also witness the darker aspects of Aztec civilization. Temples stained with the blood of human sacrifices, skull racks displaying thousands of victims. Moctezuma's initial response to your arrival seems paralyzed by indecision and possibly religious belief. Some scholars suggest he may have initially identified Quartz with the returning god Quetzalcoatl, though this interpretation remains controversial. Whatever his reasoning, Moctezuma allows your small force to enter his capital and even welcomes Quartz as a guest in his palace. A decision that proves catastrophic. The Spanish strategy becomes clear: control the emperor and rule through him. For months, this audacious plan works. Moctezuma, held under virtual house arrest, continues issuing orders, while Quartz and his men systematically learn about Aztec administration, military capabilities, and, most importantly, the location of gold treasures. Your handful of Spanish soldiers effectively control an empire through psychological manipulation and the threat of violence. But the delicate balance collapses in 1520. While Quartz is away, dealing with a rival Spanish expedition, Pedro de Alvarado orders the massacre of Aztec nobles during a religious festival. The city erupts in revolt. When Quartz returns, Moctezuma has lost all authority. During the chaotic fighting that follows, the emperor dies killed either by stones thrown by his own people or by Spanish swords, depending on which account you believe. The retreat from Tenochtitlan on the 30th of June, 1520, the Noche Triste, or Sad Night, nearly ends the conquest. You flee across the causeways in darkness, weighed down by looted gold, as Aztec warriors attack from canoes in the lake. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers drown, pulled under by the weight of their treasure. Of your original 600 men, fewer than 400 survive the retreat. But Courts demonstrates the resilience that makes him one of history's most successful conquerors. Rather than abandoning the enterprise, he spends months rebuilding his forces, gathering more indigenous allies, and preparing for a systematic siege. The smallpox epidemic that devastates central Mexico during this period kills more Aztecs than Spanish weapons ever could, including the new emperor, Cuitlahuac. The final siege of Tenochtitlan begins in May 1521 and lasts 75 days. You watch as Courts systematically destroys the causeways, connecting the island city to the mainland, cutting off food and water supplies. Spanish-built brigantines control the lake, preventing Aztec canoes from resupplying the defenders. Thousands of indigenous allies attack from the mainland, while Spanish cannons and crossbows devastate the city's defences. The end comes on the 13th of August, 1521, when Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor, is captured trying to escape by canoe. The magnificent city lies in ruins, its canals filled with rubble and corpses. The Spanish estimate that 240,000 people died during the siege, a number that may be exaggerated but reflects the catastrophic destruction of one of the world's great cities. As you stand in the ruins of Tenochtitlan, watching Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies loot the defeated city, you're witnessing one of history's most decisive moments. The conquest of the Aztec Empire establishes the pattern for Spanish imperial expansion. A small number of technologically superior Europeans, allied with indigenous groups, can topple even the most powerful native empires through superior organization, diplomatic manipulation, and sheer audacity. You wake in the dusty streets of Cajamarca on the 16th of November, 1532, watching Francisco Pizarro prepare to execute the most audacious kidnapping in history. With just 168 men, Pizarro is about to capture Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, who commands an army of 80,000 seasoned warriors. The disparity in numbers seems impossible to overcome, yet you're about to witness how Spanish cunning, superior technology, and incredible boldness can topple even the mightiest empires. The Inca Empire that awaits your conquest stretches over 2,500 miles along South America's western coast, from modern Colombia to Chile. Tawantinsuyu, as the Incas call their realm, encompasses nearly 10 million subjects speaking dozens of languages. The capital, Cusco, sits at the heart of an administrative system so sophisticated that it governs this vast territory without written language, using instead a complex system of knotted strings called quipu to record information and transmit messages across thousands of miles of mountain roads. But like the Aztec Empire, Tawantinsuyu has crucial vulnerabilities that Pizarro exploits with masterful timing. A devastating civil war between Atahualpa and his half-brother Huasca has just ended, leaving the empire exhausted and divided. Atahualpa has won, but many regions remain loyal to his defeated brother. The emperor's authority, though absolute in theory, rests on a delicate balance of religious reverence and political cooperation that can be shattered by bold action. Your small expedition has spent months learning about Inca civilization from captured subjects and indigenous allies. You've discovered that the Incas, despite their architectural and administrative achievements, have never encountered horses, steel weapons, or gunpowder. More importantly, their religious and political system centers entirely on the emperor's person control, Atahualpa, and you control the empire. The plan Pizarro devises is breathtakingly simple and dangerous. Atahualpa, Confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority and curious about these strange bearded foreigners, agrees to meet them in Cajamarca's main square. He arrives in magnificent ceremony, carried on a golden litter surrounded by nobles wearing the finest vicuse cloth and gold ornaments. Behind him march thousands of warriors, but they carry only ceremonial weapons, expecting a diplomatic encounter rather than battle. Father Vicente de Valverde approaches the emperor carrying a Bible and cross, delivering the requerimiento of the legal document demanding Atahualpa's submission to Spanish authority and Christian faith. When the emperor examines the Bible and tosses it aside, either because he cannot read or because he rejects its contents, Valverde gives the signal for attack. What follows is one of history's most one-sided massacres. Spanish cavalry charges from concealed positions, while foot soldiers with steel swords and arquebuses attack from multiple directions. The psychological impact of horses animals, unknown in the Americas, combined with the superior cutting power of steel weapons and the terrifying noise of gunpowder, creates panic among the Inca forces. In less than 2 hours, thousands of Incas lie dead in the square, while not a single Spaniard is killed. Atahualpa, his golden litter overturned and his bearers slaughtered, becomes your prisoner. The ransom negotiation that follows demonstrates both Spanish greed and Inca wealth. Atahualpa, understanding that his captors prize gold above all else, offers to fill his prison cell once with gold and twice with silver in exchange for his freedom. The room measures roughly 22 by 17 feet, with a ceiling 9 feet high, representing perhaps the largest ransom in history. Over the following months, gold and silver objects pour into Cajamarca from throughout the empire, as Inca subjects desperately try to save their emperor. But you witness the systematic melting down of artistic treasures representing centuries of Inca craftsmanship. Golden figurines, elaborate ceremonial vessels, and silver architectural decorations, all reduced to crude ingots for easier transport to Spain. The cultural destruction parallels the political conquest as Spanish priorities transform sophisticated Inca art into mere commodity wealth. Despite receiving the promised ransom, Pizarro decides Atahualpa is too dangerous to release. The emperor's execution on the 26th of July, 1533, sends shockwaves throughout Tawantinsuyu. The divine ruler, considered immortal by his subjects, has been killed by foreign invaders. The psychological impact proves as devastating as military defeat, paralyzing resistance throughout the empire. The march to Cusco reveals the full scope of Inca achievements. You travel along roads that rival Roman engineering, crossing suspension bridges spanning impossible gorges, and climbing stone staircases carved into mountain faces. Agricultural terraces transform steep Andean slopes into productive farmland. Way stations provide supplies at regular intervals along routes that connect jungle to coast across thousands of miles. Cusco itself amazes you with its massive stone construction. Walls built from precisely fitted stones, some weighing over 100 tons, demonstrate engineering capabilities that European builders cannot match. The Coricancha, the Sun Temple, contains gold plates covering entire walls until Spanish soldiers strip them away. Palaces and administrative buildings reveal the sophistication of Inca government and the wealth that has accumulated in this mountain capital over centuries. But the Spanish conquest faces its greatest challenge from Manco Inca, Atahualpa's younger brother, whom Pizarro initially installs as a puppet ruler. In 1536, Manco escapes Spanish control and leads a massive rebellion that nearly succeeds in driving the invaders from Peru. The siege of Cusco lasts over a year, with Spanish defenders barely holding the city against overwhelming numbers of Inca warriors who have learned to use captured horses and weapons. The rebellion's failure marks the end of organized Inca resistance in the heartland, but guerrilla warfare continues for decades from the remote stronghold of Vilcabamba. Spanish rule gradually extends throughout the former empire, but the transition from conquest to colonial administration proves challenging and bloody. The encomienda system grants Spanish colonists control over indigenous communities, leading to widespread exploitation and demographic collapse. The discovery of the Silver Mountain at Potosí in 1545 transforms Peru into the economic foundation of Spanish global power. This single mountain will produce more silver over the next 3 centuries than existed in all of Europe before 1492. The wealth extracted from Potosí finances Spanish military campaigns worldwide and creates the first truly global economy, connecting Peru to China, Europe, and Africa through trade networks centered on Spanish silver. As you fall asleep in this conquered land, indigenous laborers are already beginning the brutal work in Potosí's mines that will kill hundreds of thousands over the coming centuries. The conquest of Peru has given Spain control of the richest territory in the Americas, but at a cost in human suffering that will echo through generations. You wake in the Escorial Palace on the 13th of September, 1598, watching King Philip II die after ruling the most powerful empire in human history for 42 years. As his laboured breathing finally stops, you realise you're witnessing the end of an era. Philip II transformed Spain from a European regional power into the first truly global empire, but the costs of his ambitions have begun to exceed even Spain's vast New World wealth. When Philip inherited the throne in 1556, he received territories spanning 4 continents. In Europe, he controlled Spain, Portugal from 1580, the Netherlands, Sicily, Sardinia, Milan, and the Franche-Comté. In the Americas, Spanish rule extended from California to Chile, including the Philippines and scattered Pacific islands. No ruler in history had ever commanded such vast territories or such diverse populations. The wealth flowing from the Americas beggars imagination. Every year, treasure fleets carry tons of silver from Potos and New Spain to Seville. You witness the arrival of the 1,595 fleet carrying over 12 million pesos in silver, more wealth than most European kingdoms see in a decade. This silver finances not only Spanish ambitions, but transforms the global economy. Chinese merchants accept Spanish reals in payment for silk and porcelain. European prices inflate as American silver floods continental markets. Spanish coins become the world's first truly international currency, circulating from Manila to Morocco, creating economic networks that span the globe for the first time in human history. But you witness the paradox of Spanish power. Immense wealth accompanied by constant financial crisis. Philip II's empire requires enormous expenses, maintaining armies in the Netherlands, defending Mediterranean trade routes against Ottoman fleets, supporting Catholic causes throughout Europe, and administering territories on multiple continents. Despite unprecedented revenues, the Spanish crown declares bankruptcy in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. Interest payments on accumulated debt consume more than half of royal income before any government expenses are met, creating a vicious cycle where Spanish silver finances European bankers rather than Spanish power. The religious dimension of Philip's reign defines Spanish imperial identity. He sees himself as Catholicism's champion against Protestant heretics and Muslim infidels. The Spanish Inquisition reaches its peak of influence during his reign, pursuing religious orthodoxy with fanatical intensity that extends throughout the empire. In the Americas, missionaries worked to convert indigenous populations while destroying pre-Columbian religious traditions. The empire becomes an instrument of Catholic evangelization as much as political control, with Philip viewing temporal power as inseparable from spiritual mission. Your empire's military power appears unstoppable during the first decades of Philip's reign. Spanish tercios dominate European battlefields with their combination of disciplined pikemen and arquebusiers, creating tactical formations that revolutionize warfare. At the Battle of Street, Quentin in 1557, Spanish forces crush French armies, demonstrating military superiority that seems unassailable. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 sees your fleet, allied with Venice and the Papal States, crush Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean. Don Juan of Austria's victory effectively ends Ottoman expansion westward and establishes Spain as the Mediterranean's dominant power, controlling trade routes that connect Europe with Asia and Africa. But the greatest test of Spanish power comes from an unexpected source: the Dutch revolt beginning in 1566. What starts as resistance to increased taxation and religious persecution escalates into a full-scale independence war that drains Spanish resources for decades. The Netherlands' strategic location, commercial wealth, and Protestant determination create a conflict that Spanish military superiority cannot easily resolve. The Duke of Alba's brutal campaign from 1567 to 1573 demonstrates Spanish ruthlessness, executing prominent nobles, including the Counts of Egmont and Horn, implementing new taxes that devastate the economy, and establishing military tribunals that sentence thousands to death. Yet this brutality fails to pacify the rebellious provinces, and instead turns moderate opposition into implacable resistance. The Siege of Leiden in 1574 reveals how Dutch determination can overcome Spanish military advantages. When Spanish forces surround the city, cutting off food supplies and causing widespread starvation, the defenders refuse to surrender. Instead, they break the dikes and flood the surrounding countryside, forcing the Spanish army to withdraw as their siege positions disappear underwater. This victory demonstrates that Spanish power has limits and that determined resistance can succeed against overwhelming odds. Your struggles in the Netherlands reveal a fundamental problem. Spanish military methods, designed for quick campaigns and decisive battles, prove inadequate for controlling hostile populations. The more force Spain applies, the more resistance grows. The financial cost becomes staggering. The Netherlands War consumes more silver than flows from the Americas, forcing Philip to borrow against future treasure fleet arrivals at ruinous interest rates that create the debt crises plaguing his reign. The annexation of Portugal in 1580 represents the height of Spanish territorial expansion. Philip's claim to the Portuguese throne through his mother, Isabella of Portugal, allows him to unite the Iberian Peninsula under Spanish rule following the death of King Sebastian in Morocco. More importantly, he acquires Portugal's extensive colonial empire, Brazil, trading posts in Africa and Asia, and established commercial networks throughout the Indian Ocean. This union creates the first empire upon which the sun never sets. Spanish territories now stretch from the Philippines westward to Brazil, encompassing roughly 13% of the world's land surface. The combined Spanish-Portuguese Empire includes trade networks connecting Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas in ways previously impossible. Chinese silk purchased with American silver travels to Mexico, then crosses the Atlantic to Spain, and finally reaches Antwerp for sale throughout northern Europe. Brazilian sugar supports Portuguese trading posts in Africa, while African slaves work Spanish-American mines. The Manila-Acapulco galleon trade connects Asian markets with American silver, creating the Pacific as a Spanish lake where treasures flow in carefully organized annual convoys. But managing this global empire strains Spanish administrative capabilities beyond their limits. Communication between Madrid and Manila takes over a year, making coordinated policy implementation impossible. Colonial officials operate with minimal supervision, leading to corruption, inefficiency, and local conflicts that Madrid cannot quickly resolve. The empire's very size becomes a source of weakness as much as strength, as Philip attempts to govern territories whose diversity and distance make unified administration nearly impossible. The cultural achievements of Philip's reign establish Spain as Europe's artistic and intellectual centre. The Spanish Golden Age produces Miguel de Cervantes, whose Don Quixote becomes world literature's first modern novel, reflecting Spanish society's transition from confident expansion to the complex realities of maintaining global empire. Lope de Vega writes over 800 plays that define Spanish drama, creating theatre that attracts audiences from nobles to commoners, all watching performances that explore themes of honour, social mobility, and imperial identity. Pedro Caldern de la Barca develops drama in philosophical directions, with masterpieces like Life is a Dream, exploring reality and moral responsibility that resonates with a society grappling with ethical implications of global dominance. Diego Velázquez revolutionizes European painting through works that combine technical brilliance with subtle social commentary. His portraits of Philip IV revealing psychological complexity behind imperial power, while his studio in Madrid's Alcázar Palace provides access to artistic treasures from across the empire. Spanish mystical literature flourishes through Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, whose spiritual writings combine medieval Christian traditions with distinctively Spanish emotional intensity, reflecting the empire's religious mission while exploring personal divine experience. The architectural legacy of Philip's reign reflects both imperial ambitions and unprecedented cultural synthesis. The Escorial, completed in 1584 after 21 years of construction, combines royal palace, monastery, and mausoleum in a massive granite complex that serves as the nerve centre of global empire. Philip II personally reviews thousands of documents annually from this austere residence, making marginal notations on reports covering everything from Potos's silver shipments to missionary activities in the Philippines. Colonial churches throughout the Americas display Spanish wealth through elaborate Baroque decoration that incorporates indigenous artistic traditions, creating distinctively American styles like the cathedrals of Mexico City and Lima that rival European counterparts while demonstrating cultural creativity within Spanish imperial frameworks. Urban planning in Spanish colonial cities follows the laws of the Indies, creating consistent patterns centered on main plazas surrounded by cathedrals and government buildings that establish orderly, defensible settlements from California to Argentina, while also facilitating the cultural integration that produces the remarkable architectural synthesis of European, indigenous, and African elements that defines colonial Spanish American civilization. The scientific achievements of this golden age contribute significantly to European knowledge through systematic exploration and documentation of imperial territories. Spanish expeditions map coastlines from California to Chile with unprecedented precision, while naturalists catalogue American flora and fauna unknown to European science. The Casa de Contratación in Seville becomes Europe's leading centre for navigational science, developing new instruments and techniques that facilitate ocean travel. Franciscan and Jesuit missionaries learn indigenous languages, creating dictionaries and grammars that preserve linguistic knowledge while facilitating religious conversion. As you watch Philip II's funeral procession wind through Madrid's streets, black-clad mourners reflect on an empire at its zenith, but showing signs of strain. The failed armada of 1,588 against England demonstrated that Spanish power, however vast, has limits when English fireships scattered the Great Fleet and storms completed its destruction. Financial problems persist despite American silver, requiring constant borrowing that enriches foreign bankers while impoverishing the Spanish treasury. The Netherlands remain in revolt, draining resources while providing dangerous examples of successful resistance. Ottoman pressure continues in the Mediterranean, requiring expensive naval operations to maintain Spanish dominance. Yet the empire Philip leaves to his son represents humanity's first truly global political system. Spanish law, language, and religion have been established on every inhabited continent. Trade networks connect previously isolated regions through silver flows that create the first worldwide economy. Cultural exchange has begun processes that will reshape human civilization as European, indigenous, African, and Asian elements combine in new synthetic forms throughout Spanish territories. The Spanish Empire of 1598 has created the foundation for the modern, interconnected world, establishing patterns of globalization that continue influencing international relations, economic systems, and cultural development today. You wake in Madrid on the 31st of March, 1621, watching as Philip IV ascends the throne of an empire showing its first serious cracks. At just 16, the new king inherits territories as vast as his predecessors, but the challenges have multiplied beyond any single ruler's capacity to manage. What you're witnessing is the beginning of Spain's long decline from global superpower to regional European state, a process that will unfold over 2 centuries as the burdens of empire gradually exceed its benefits. The problems Philip IV faces would overwhelm any monarch, no matter how capable. The 30 Years' War rages across Central Europe, requiring massive Spanish intervention to support Catholic Habsburg cousins against Protestant coalitions backed by France. The Dutch continue their rebellion, now in its 5th decade, draining Spanish resources while building their own commercial empire that directly challenges Spanish trade monopolies. France, under Cardinal Richelieu's guidance, systematically works to break Spanish hegemony by supporting Spain's enemies everywhere, while carefully avoiding direct confrontation that might unite Spanish territories against a common threat. Meanwhile, the American colonies demand increasing military protection against Dutch, English, and French encroachment on territories that Spain lacks sufficient forces to defend adequately. Pirates and privateers attack treasure fleets with unprecedented success, capturing millions in silver before it reaches Spain. The Pacific Ocean, once a Spanish lake, now hosts Dutch and English expeditions, seeking to establish competing trade routes and colonial settlements. Your empire's financial situation has become desperate despite continued silver imports from Potos and New Spain. The Crown cannot meet its obligations, as interest payments on accumulated debt consume more than half of all revenues before any government expenses are met. The Crown has debased the currency repeatedly, creating inflation that devastates ordinary Spaniards while enriching foreign bankers who finance Spanish borrowing at increasingly ruinous rates. Genoese, German, and Dutch financiers effectively control Spanish fiscal policy, demanding territorial concessions and commercial privileges in exchange for loans needed to maintain basic government operations. The Count Duke of Olivares, Philip IV's chief minister, recognizes that Spain's problems require radical solutions that challenge traditional privileges and regional autonomies. His Union of Arms proposal attempts to distribute defense costs more equitably across the empire's various territories, arguing that all Spanish dominions should contribute proportionally to imperial defense, rather than expecting Castile to bear the entire burden. But this rational policy encounters fierce resistance from regions that have maintained their traditional privileges and local laws since joining the Spanish monarchy. Catalonia, the richest and most commercially developed region of Spain, refuses to contribute proportionally to imperial defense, while demanding that royal troops respect Catalan privileges and local customs. The Aragonese nobility insists on maintaining their traditional rights and exemptions from royal taxation. Portugal, united with Spain since 1580, increasingly resents Castilian dominance and the diversion of Portuguese resources to Spanish European wars that provide no benefit to Portuguese colonial interests in Brazil, Africa, and Asia. The Italian territories, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and Milan, resist increased taxation while providing minimal military support for Spanish operations elsewhere. Each territory maintains its own legal system, tax structure, and administrative traditions that complicate unified imperial policy. The diversity that had been a source of Spanish strength during the expansion phase becomes a source of weakness, as regional interests override imperial solidarity when the empire faces serious external threats. The year 1640 becomes known as the Year of Revolutions, when multiple Spanish territories simultaneously rebel against royal authority. The Catalan revolt begins when local authorities resist royal attempts to quarter Castilian troops in their region during the French War. What starts as a jurisdictional dispute over military billeting escalates into full rebellion when Catalans murder the viceroy and invite French military protection. Within months, Catalonia becomes a French protectorate, providing France with a base for attacking Spain's Mediterranean coast. Portugal chooses this moment of Spanish weakness to declare independence under the Duke of Braganza, who becomes King John IV with English and French support. The Portuguese independence movement succeeds because it enjoys broad popular support and foreign assistance, while Spain lacks available military forces to suppress the rebellion. The loss of Portugal removes not only European territory, but the entire Portuguese colonial empire in Brazil, Africa, and Asia, effectively cutting Spanish imperial revenues by nearly 1/3. These simultaneous rebellions reveal the empire's fundamental weakness. It remains a collection of separate territories held together by personal loyalty to the Spanish monarch, rather than any sense of shared identity or common interest. When that loyalty weakens under the pressure of increased taxation and military obligations, the empire fragments along its natural fault lines. The very diversity that had made Spanish expansion possible now makes Spanish unity impossible to maintain. Your armies, once invincible, now suffer defeats that would have been unthinkable during the previous century. At the Battle of Rocroi in 1643, French forces under the Duke of Enghien crush a Spanish army and capture its legendary commander, the Count of Fuentes, destroying the myth of tercio invincibility that had sustained Spanish military reputation for over a century. The defeat sends shockwaves throughout Europe. If Spanish infantry can be beaten in open battle by French forces, Spanish military supremacy has clear limits that enemies can exploit. The tactical innovations that had made Spanish tercios dominant, the combination of pikes, arquebuses, and disciplined formations, have been adopted and improved by other European armies, while Spanish military organization has remained largely unchanged. French artillery proves more mobile and effective than Spanish cannons, while Dutch and Swedish infantry formations demonstrate greater flexibility than rigid Spanish tactics. The military revolution that Spain had initiated now works against Spanish interests as other nations develop superior weapons and tactics. The Dutch War, which has consumed Spanish resources for over 70 years, finally ends with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, though Spain initially refuses to accept the general European settlement. Spain formally recognizes Dutch independence in a separate treaty, abandoning territories that had been among Europe's wealthiest and most commercially developed. The loss is both economic and psychological. The Dutch Republic becomes a major commercial power precisely because it has escaped Spanish control, suggesting that Spanish rule actually hinders rather than promotes prosperity. The Peace of Westphalia marks a fundamental shift in European politics, replacing the religious conflicts that had dominated the previous century with a new system based on state sovereignty and balance of power. Spain's role as Catholicism's champion becomes irrelevant in this new international system, while French diplomatic skill and military power establish France as Europe's dominant state. Spanish diplomacy, accustomed to dictating terms from a position of overwhelming strength, proves inadequate for managing relationships among equal sovereign states. In the Americas, your colonial empire faces new challenges as other European powers establish competing settlements and challenge Spanish trade monopolies. The English found Virginia and Massachusetts, creating bases for future expansion down the North American coast. The French explore the Great Lakes and Mississippi River, claiming vast territories in North America's interior that potentially surround Spanish settlements in Florida and the Gulf Coast. The Dutch establish New Amsterdam and challenge Spanish control of Caribbean trade routes, offering better prices and more favorable terms to colonial merchants. Most threatening of all, these rival powers prove more effective at attracting permanent settlers who create self-sustaining colonial societies. English colonies grow through family immigration and natural population increase, creating communities with strong local institutions and economic independence. French colonies, though smaller, develop extensive trade networks with indigenous peoples, while establishing strategic positions that control key river systems and portages. The economic problems affecting Spain increasingly impact colonial administration as reduced silver flows and administrative corruption undermine effective government. Colonial officials, underpaid and undersupplied from Spain, become more corrupt and less effective at maintaining royal authority. The encomienda system breaks down as indigenous populations decline from disease and exploitation, forcing colonists to rely more heavily on enslaved African labor, imported through increasingly expensive and unreliable Spanish suppliers. Regional economies in the Americas begin developing independent trade networks that reduce dependence on Spanish-manufactured goods while creating colonial industries that compete with Spanish production. Mexican textile workshops supply local markets previously served by Spanish imports. Peruvian shipyards build vessels for Pacific coast trade. Colonial agriculture expands beyond traditional export crops to serve local consumption, reducing demand for Spanish food imports. Your empire's cultural production, which had flourished during the Golden Age, begins reflecting the pessimism and disillusionment of imperial decline. Writers like Baltasar Gracian explore themes of moral decay and social corruption that seem to mirror Spanish political difficulties. Painters like Jos de Ribera create works that emphasize suffering and martyrdom rather than triumph and glory. The literature and art of this period capture Spain's transition from confident expansion to anxious introspection about imperial purpose and sustainability. The Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659 formally acknowledges France as Europe's dominant power while relegating Spain to secondary status in European affairs. Spain cedes territories in Flanders and along the Franco-Spanish border, marking the definitive end of Spanish hegemony in European politics. The marriage of Louis XIV to Philip IV's daughter, Maria Theresa, symbolically transfers European leadership from the Spanish to the French branch of the Habsburg family, though with renunciations that prove meaningless when the Spanish succession crisis arrives. As you drift to sleep in this troubled empire, Spanish forces are still fighting desperately to maintain their remaining territories, but the tide has clearly turned against Spanish interests everywhere. The empire built through audacious conquest and sustained by American wealth is learning that even the richest empires cannot indefinitely support unlimited commitments against determined enemies. The age of Spanish dominance is ending, though the empire itself will persist for centuries more, as Spain gradually adapts to its reduced circumstances and learns to manage a more limited but potentially more sustainable imperial role. You wake in the Alcazar Palace on the 1st of November, 1700, watching King Charles II, the bewitched, struggle through his final hours as the last Spanish Habsburg ruler. His grotesquely deformed body, the product of generations of royal inbreeding, barely clings to life as European powers position themselves for the succession crisis that will reshape the continental balance of power. The dying king's will, naming Philip of Anjou grandson of Francis Louis XIV as his successor, threatens to unite the Spanish and French empires under Bourbon rule, creating a colossus that would dominate Europe and the world for generations. Charles II's death ignites the War of Spanish Succession, the most devastating European conflict since the 30 Years' War and the first truly global war in human history. The Grand Alliance England, Austria, the Netherlands, Portugal, and most German states immediately mobilizes to prevent French hegemony, while France and Spain prepare to defend Philip V's inheritance against a coalition that commands superior naval power and extensive financial resources. What begins as a dynastic dispute becomes a struggle for global dominance that will be fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, South America, and even the distant Philippines. The war's global character reflects how European imperial expansion has created worldwide strategic interests that make local conflicts into international confrontations. English attacks on Spanish colonial ports serve dual purposes, weakening Spanish resistance while capturing wealth needed to finance the European war effort. Dutch expeditions against Spanish Pacific coast settlements demonstrate how colonial warfare can affect the balance of power in European theatres. French support for Spanish defence of the Americas shows how colonial resources have become essential to European military capabilities. You watch Spanish armies struggle on multiple fronts as the empire's enemies coordinate attacks designed to dismember your vast territories through systematic application of superior resources. The English Navy blockades Spanish ports, strangling trade with the Americas and preventing reinforcement of colonial garrisons. Austrian armies invade northern Italy, threatening Spanish control of Milan and Naples while opening a new front that diverts resources from other theatres. Portuguese forces attack across the Spanish border with English support, creating another drain on Spanish military capabilities already stretched beyond their limits. The Siege of Gibraltar in 1704 marks a turning point in Spanish fortunes that reveals how naval warfare has become crucial to imperial survival. Anglo-Dutch forces capture this strategic fortress through amphibious assault supported by massive naval bombardment, demonstrating superior coordination between land and sea forces. Despite repeated Spanish attempts to retake Gibraltar, employing some of the finest military engineers in Europe, the fortress remains in English hands due to British control of the surrounding seas. The loss cut Spain off from secure Mediterranean communication, while providing England with a permanent base for threatening Spanish shipping and colonial connections. More psychologically devastating than the military defeat is the realization that Gibraltar falls through the treachery of local Spanish commanders who abandon their positions without adequate resistance. This betrayal reveals how deeply the empire's internal divisions have weakened its defensive capabilities, as regional loyalties override imperial solidarity when faced with foreign invasion. The capture occurs because Spanish naval power has declined to the point where England can conduct amphibious operations against Spanish territory with impunity. In the Americas, the war disrupts the colonial economy that has sustained Spanish power for 2 centuries, while demonstrating how global conflicts can transform local societies. English and Dutch privateers attack treasure fleets with unprecedented success, capturing millions in silver before it reaches Spain and depriving the Spanish crown of revenues needed for European military operations. The 1,708 capture of the San Jose's galleon off Cartagena cost Spain over 11 million pesos in silver, equivalent to an entire year's colonial revenues, while providing England with funds that support military operations in multiple theatres. Colonial trade networks collapse as Spanish naval protection proves inadequate against coordinated enemy attacks that exploit superior intelligence and local knowledge. For the first time since the conquest, Spanish colonies must survive largely on their own resources, rather than depending on regular contact with the mother country. This forced self-reliance strengthens colonial economies while weakening imperial ties, as colonists develop independent trade relationships and local industries that reduce dependence on Spanish imports. The Battle of Almansa in 1707 demonstrates both Spanish military resilience and the war's increasingly bitter character as dynastic conflict becomes civil war. Philip V's forces, commanded by French generals and reinforced by Irish exiles in French service, crush the Allied army and secure the new king's hold on the Spanish throne. But the victory comes at enormous cost in both casualties and destruction, as the battle devastates Valencia's countryside and leads to brutal repression of regions that had supported the Austrian claimant, Archduke Charles. The aftermath of Almansa reveals how the war transforms from international conflict into domestic persecution, as Philip V uses military victory to eliminate traditional regional privileges and impose centralized Bourbon rule. Aragonese and Valencian nobles who supported the Austrian cause face execution or exile, while their properties are confiscated and redistributed to Castilian supporters of the new dynasty. The war thus becomes an instrument of internal conquest that destroys the federal character of the Spanish monarchy. The siege of Barcelona from 1713 to 1714 becomes a symbol of Catalan resistance to Bourbon centralization and French-influenced absolutism. Despite being abandoned by their English allies, who signed separate peace agreements recognizing Philip V, the Catalans continue fighting for over a year under the leadership of Rafael Casanova and other patriotic leaders. The defenders preferred destruction to surrender, maintaining resistance even as French artillery reduces much of the city to rubble and starvation ravages the civilian population. When Barcelona finally falls on the 11th of September, 1714, a date still commemorated as Catalonia's National Day to Philip V, abolishes Catalan privileges and imposes Castilian law throughout his domains through the Nueva Planta decrees. The Bourbon victory establishes centralized monarchy, modeled on French absolutism, but destroys the consensual federal system that had characterized Spanish government for centuries, replacing negotiated cooperation with bureaucratic command that breeds resentment throughout the empire's peripheral regions. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 forces Spain to make devastating territorial concessions that effectively end Spanish pretensions to European great power status. You watch as negotiators systematically dismember your European empire. The Spanish Netherlands go to Austria, providing a buffer against French expansion. Sicily goes to Savoy, later exchanged for Sardinia. Naples and Sardinia go to Austria, eliminating Spanish influence in southern Italy. Gibraltar and Minorca go to England, providing permanent British bases in the Mediterranean that can threaten Spanish communications and commerce. Most humiliatingly, Spain grants England the Asiento exclusive rights to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America for 30 years, creating a permanent breach in your colonial trade monopoly while legitimizing British commercial penetration Spanish colonial markets. This concession represents more than economic loss. It acknowledges that Spain can no longer defend its most fundamental imperial interests against determined foreign pressure, opening the way for further erosions of Spanish colonial control. The human cost of this catastrophic war staggers comprehension and reveals how imperial conflicts can devastate the societies they claim to protect. Spain's population declines by over 500,000 during the 14-year conflict as armies devastate the countryside and economic disruption causes famine and disease. Entire regions like Catalonia and Valencia suffer systematic destruction that requires generations to repair. The colonial economy contracts dramatically as silver production falls and trade routes remain disrupted by enemy naval action, reducing imperial revenues by nearly half. The war transforms Spain from a European great power focused on continental dominance into a second-rank state concerned primarily with defending its remaining territories against further encroachment. The enormous military expenditures required for wartime operations exhaust the royal treasury while creating debt burdens that constrained Spanish policy for decades after peace is restored. Spain emerges from the war smaller, poorer, and more vulnerable than at any time since the union of Castile and Aragon. But the Bourbon victory also brings unexpected opportunities for renewal and reform that previous Spanish governments had been unable to implement. Philip V, trained in French administrative methods and supported by advisors experienced in Colbert's economic policies, begins modernizing Spanish government along more efficient lines. The Nueva Planta decrees, while destroying traditional liberties, also eliminate the jurisdictional chaos that had weakened previous Spanish governments by creating competing authorities and conflicting legal systems. The new dynasty possesses energy and administrative competence that the degenerate later Habsburgs had lost through excessive inbreeding and political isolation. French-influenced reforms streamlined colonial administration, encouraged trade, and begin developing colonial resources more systematically. The creation of new viceroyalties and the reorganization of colonial trade through registered ships rather than restrictive annual fleets demonstrate renewed Spanish competence in imperial management. Your empire emerges from this catastrophic war, smaller but potentially more manageable, freed from expensive European commitments that had drained Spanish resources for centuries. The loss of Italian and Netherlands territories eliminates costly defensive obligations while focusing imperial attention on the Americas, where Spanish rule remains largely unchallenged and vast territories await more systematic development. The Bourbon dynasty brings French-influenced reforms that gradually restore Spanish power, though never again to its former heights of global dominance. As you fall asleep in this transformed Spain, French advisors are already working to modernize everything from military organization to economic policy, while Spanish administrators begin implementing colonial reforms that will characterize the 18th century revival. The Spanish Empire has survived its greatest existential crisis since the conquests, but survival has required fundamental changes that alter its essential character from Habsburg Catholic monarchy to Bourbon enlightened despotism. The old empire of religious crusade and aristocratic privilege is giving way to a more modern state focused on administrative efficiency and economic development. You wake in Madrid on the 9th of July, 1746, watching King Philip V abdicate in favour of his son Ferdinand VI, then return to the throne when Ferdinand dies in 1759, only to see Charles III ascend as the greatest reformer in Spanish imperial history. This dynastic confusion reflects your empire's broader transformation as the Bourbon dynasty systematically modernizes Spanish government and colonial administration with energy not seen since the conquest era. Charles III, who ruled Naples before becoming King of Spain, brings Italian Enlightenment ideas and French administrative methods to your stagnant empire. His reign from 1759 to 1788 represents the Spanish Enlightenment's peak, as royal officials trained in modern economics and political theory implement sweeping reforms designed to restore Spanish power through rational government and economic development. The colonial reforms you witness fundamentally restructure the imperial economy. The creation of new viceroyalties, New Granada, 1717, and Rue de la Plata, 1776, divides the unwieldy Peruvian viceroyalty and brings royal government closer to remote regions. Buenos Aires transforms from a minor port into a major commercial centre, as silver from Potos now flows eastward to the Atlantic rather than westward to Panama and the Pacific. The most revolutionary change comes with Comercio Libre, free trade, beginning in 1778, which abolishes the centuries-old monopoly system concentrated in Seville and Cadiz. Spanish merchants in any authorized port can now trade directly with the Americas, while colonial ports can trade with each other rather than only with Spain. This reform unleashes entrepreneurial energies long suppressed by bureaucratic restrictions, leading to dramatic increases in colonial trade volumes. You witness the establishment of new governmental institutions designed to increase royal control while improving administrative efficiency. Intendants, modelled on the French system, replace corrupt provincial governors and introduce uniform administration throughout the empire. These royal officials, trained in Madrid and responsible directly to the crown, bring professional competence to colonial government while reducing the autonomy that had allowed local elites to ignore royal policies. The expulsion of the Jesuits in 1767 demonstrates the Bourbon commitment to centralized royal authority. The Society of Jesus had become virtually a state within the state, controlling vast territories in Paraguay, operating the most prestigious educational institutions, and maintaining loyalty to the Pope rather than Spanish kings. Their sudden expulsion eliminates a powerful rival to royal authority while freeing their extensive properties for redistribution to royal supporters. Economic development becomes a crown priority as Spanish officials embrace mercantilist theories, emphasizing the need to increase national wealth through expanded production and trade. Royal monopolies on tobacco, salt, and other commodities provide steady revenues, while regulatory reforms encourage agricultural improvements and proto-industrial development. The creation of consulados, merchant guilds, in major colonial cities promotes commercial growth while maintaining royal supervision. Your military undergoes comprehensive reform as Spanish officials recognize that imperial defense requires professional armies rather than the poorly trained militias that had proven inadequate during recent wars. The regular army in the Americas expands dramatically, with new regiments recruited both from Spain and the colonies. These forces receive modern training, standardized equipment, and professional officers, creating military capabilities that can defend colonial territories against increasing foreign threats. The intellectual transformation accompanying these reforms brings Enlightenment ideas to Spanish and colonial society. Economic societies promote agricultural improvements and technical education. New universities and scientific institutions encourage practical learning rather than purely theoretical studies. Royal scientific expeditions explore colonial territories, cataloguing natural resources and mapping territories with unprecedented precision. But these reforms also create unintended consequences that will eventually threaten imperial unity. Colonial elites, educated in Enlightenment ideas and granted greater economic opportunities, begin questioning why they remain subordinate to European-born Spaniards. The expansion of trade increases colonial wealth and confidence, while reducing dependence on Spain. Military reforms create colonial officers with professional competence and institutional loyalty that transcends personal loyalty to distant monarchs. The American Revolution, from 1775 to 1783, provides your empire with an opportunity to weaken England while demonstrating the dangers of colonial rebellion. Spain enters the war in 1779, hoping to recover Gibraltar and Florida while supporting American independence. The successful siege of Pensacola in 1781 and the recovery of Florida in 1783 represent significant Spanish victories, but the spectacle of successful colonial rebellion against European rule provides dangerous precedents for your own colonies. Your colonial society becomes increasingly complex as economic growth and administrative reform create new opportunities for social mobility. The Sistema de Castas, caste system, attempts to maintain social order through racial classifications, but economic reality increasingly matters more than legal status. Creole elites, American-born Spanish descendants, accumulate wealth and education while remaining excluded from the highest administrative positions reserved for Peninsular Spaniards. The cultural flowering accompanying Bourbon reforms produces distinctive colonial American achievements in architecture, literature, and intellectual life. Baroque churches and public buildings demonstrate colonial wealth and artistic sophistication. Colonial writers and scientists contribute to Enlightenment discourse, while developing distinctively American perspectives on universal themes. Universities in Mexico City, Lima, and other colonial centers become genuine intellectual communities rather than mere training schools for clergy. As you drift asleep in this revitalized empire, Spanish territories stretch from Alaska to Argentina, from the Philippines to Louisiana. Colonial trade has expanded dramatically. Royal revenues have increased substantially, and administrative efficiency has improved markedly. The Spanish Empire appears to have successfully adapted to Enlightenment principles while maintaining imperial unity. Yet beneath this apparent success, the seeds of dissolution are already planted. Colonial elites have gained wealth, education, and confidence while remaining politically subordinate. Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and popular sovereignty circulate among people capable of applying them to their own situations. The very success of Bourbon reforms has created colonial societies capable of imagining independence from European rule. On the 31st of March, 1621, watching as Philip IV ascends the throne of an empire, showing its first serious cracks. At just 16, the new king inherits territories as vast as his predecessors, but the challenges have multiplied beyond any single ruler's capacity to manage. What you're witnessing is the beginning of Spain's long decline from global superpower to regional European state. The problems Philip IV faces would overwhelm any monarch. The 30 Years' War rages across Central Europe, requiring massive Spanish intervention to support Catholic Habsburg cousins. The Dutch continue their rebellion, now in its 5th decade, draining Spanish resources while building their own commercial empire. France, under Cardinal Richelieu's guidance, systematically works to break Spanish hegemony by supporting Spain's enemies everywhere. Meanwhile, the American colonies demand increasing military protection against Dutch, English, and French encroachment. Your empire's financial situation has become desperate. Despite unprecedented silver imports from Potos and New Spain, the Spanish crown cannot meet its obligations. Interest payments on accumulated debt consume more than half of all revenues before any government expenses are met. The crown has debased the currency repeatedly, creating inflation that devastates ordinary Spaniards while enriching foreign bankers who finance Spanish borrowing. The Count Duke of Olivares, Philip IV's chief minister, recognizes that Spain's problems require radical solutions. His Union of Arms proposal attempts to distribute defence costs more equitably across the empire's various territories. But this rational policy encounters fierce resistance from regions that have maintained their traditional privileges. Catalonia, Portugal, and the Italian territories refuse to contribute proportionally to imperial defence, creating a constitutional crisis that weakens Spain just when unity is most needed. The year 1640 becomes known as the Year of Revolutions, when multiple Spanish territories simultaneously rebel. The Catalan revolt begins when local authorities resist royal attempts to quarter Castilian troops in their region. What starts as a jurisdictional dispute escalates into full rebellion when Catalans murder the viceroy and invite French protection. Portugal, united with Spain since 1580, chooses this moment to declare independence under the Duke of Braganza, who becomes King John IV. These simultaneous rebellions reveal the empire's fundamental weakness. It remains a collection of separate territories held together by personal loyalty to the Spanish monarch rather than any sense of shared identity or common interest. When that loyalty weakens, the empire fragments along its natural fault lines. The loss of Portugal is particularly devastating, removing not only European territory, but the entire Portuguese colonial empire in Brazil, Africa, and Asia. Your armies, once invincible, now suffer defeats that would have been unthinkable during the previous century. At the Battle of Rocroi in 1643, French forces crush a Spanish army and capture its legendary commander, destroying the myth of tercio invincibility. The defeat sends shockwaves throughout Europe. If Spanish infantry can be beaten in open battle, Spanish power has clear limits. The Dutch War, which has consumed Spanish resources for over 70 years, finally ends with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Spain formally recognizes Dutch independence, abandoning territories that had been among Europe's wealthiest. The loss is both economic and psychological. The Dutch Republic becomes a major commercial power precisely because it has escaped Spanish control, suggesting that Spanish rule actually hinders rather than promotes prosperity. In the Americas, your colonial empire faces new challenges as other European powers establish competing settlements. The English found Virginia and Massachusetts, creating bases for future expansion. The French explore the Great Lakes and Mississippi River, claiming vast territories in North America's interior. The Dutch establish New Amsterdam and challenge Spanish control of Caribbean trade routes. Most threatening of all, these rivals prove more effective at attracting permanent settlers, creating colonies that grow through immigration rather than depending entirely on indigenous labor. The economic problems affecting Spain increasingly impact colonial administration. Colonial officials, underpaid and undersupplied from Spain, become more corrupt and less effective. The encomienda system breaks down as indigenous populations decline, forcing colonists to rely more heavily on enslaved African labor. Regional economies in the Americas begin developing independent trade networks, gradually weakening ties to Spain and creating the foundation for future independence movements. Your empire's cultural production, which flourished during the Golden Age, begins reflecting the pessimism of imperial decline. Writers like Baltasar Gracian explore themes of disillusionment and moral decay. Painters like Diego Velázquez create masterpieces that subtly critique royal pretensions and social inequality. The literature and art of this period capture Spain's transition from confident expansion to anxious introspection about imperial purpose and sustainability. The Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659 formally acknowledges France as Europe's dominant power. Spain cedes territories in Flanders and along the Franco-Spanish border, marking the definitive end of Spanish hegemony in European affairs. The marriage of Louis XIV to Philip IV's daughter, Maria Theresa, symbolically transfers European leadership from the Spanish to the French Habsburgs. As you drift to sleep in this troubled empire, Spanish forces are still fighting desperately to maintain their remaining territories, but the tide has clearly turned. The empire built through audacious conquest and sustained by American wealth is learning that even the richest empires cannot indefinitely support unlimited commitments. The age of Spanish dominance is ending, though the empire itself will persist for centuries more. You wake in Madrid on the 19th of March, 1808, watching King Charles IV abdicate in favour of his son Ferdinand VII, only to see Napoleon Bonaparte force both Spanish kings to renounce their crowns in favour of his brother Joseph. This unprecedented crisis, the Spanish throne occupied by a French usurper while legitimate monarchs languish in French captivity, triggers the most catastrophic period in Spanish imperial history. The Spanish people's response to French occupation surprises everyone, including the Spanish themselves. Rather than accepting Joseph Bonaparte as their new king, spontaneous rebellions erupt throughout Spain. The siege of Zaragoza becomes legendary for its heroic resistance, while guerrilla warfare devastates French armies accustomed to conventional European battles. The Spanish War of Independence demonstrates that even the mighty Napoleonic military machine cannot easily subdue a determined population fighting for national survival. But in the Americas, the crisis creates an entirely different dynamic. Colonial elites, trained in Enlightenment political theory and accustomed to growing autonomy under Bourbon reforms, must decide whether to recognize Joseph Bonaparte, remain loyal to the captive Ferdinand VII, or govern themselves until legitimate authority is restored. This last option initially conceived as temporary expedient, gradually evolves into permanent independence movements. You witness the establishment of juntas throughout Spanish America, local governing bodies that claim to rule in Ferdinand VII's name while exercising complete autonomy. In Caracas, Buenos Aires, Bogotá, and other colonial capitals, Creole elites assume political power for the first time since the conquest. What begins as emergency government during the imperial crisis becomes practical experience in self-rule that makes future independence seem both possible and desirable. The personality dominating this transformative period is Simón Bolívar, the Venezuelan aristocrat whose vision extends far beyond local autonomy to continental liberation. Bolívar's military campaigns across North and South America demonstrate strategic genius combined with political idealism. His victories at Boyac, 1819, and Carabobo, 1821, establish independent nations, while his political writings articulate theories of American government adapted to local conditions. But the independence wars prove far more complex and bloody than simple struggles between Spanish loyalists and American patriots. Regional conflicts, social tensions, and personal rivalries create civil wars within the broader independence movement. In Venezuela, the Llaneros, plainsmen, initially support Spain because they distrust the Creole elite more than distant monarchs. In Mexico, the independence movement begins with Hidalgo's indigenous and mestizo uprising, which terrifies both Spanish officials and Creole landowners. Just as San Martin represents a different model of independence leadership, the professional military officer whose campaigns demonstrate careful planning rather than Bolívar's improvisational brilliance. San Martin's crossing of the Andes to liberate Chile and his subsequent invasion of Peru show how geographic knowledge and strategic patience can overcome Spanish defensive advantages. The meeting between San Martin and Bolívar in Guayaquil, 1822, determines South America's political future when San Martin withdraws, leaving Bolívar to complete the liberation of Peru. The Mexican independence movement follows its own unique trajectory, beginning with social revolution before evolving into conservative reaction. Miguel Hidalgo's Grito de Dolores in 1810 triggers a massive uprising of indigenous peoples and mestizos, seeking not only independence from Spain, but also fundamental social change. When this popular movement threatens elite interests, both Spanish and Creole conservatives unite to suppress it. Mexican independence finally comes in 1821 through Agustín de Iturbide's plan of Iguala, which promises independence while protecting social hierarchy. Your empire's military response to these independence movements reveals both Spanish resilience and ultimate limitations. Expeditionary forces, like Pablo Morillo's army in Venezuela, initially achieve significant successes, recapturing major cities and suppressing rebel governments. But Spain lacks the resources to maintain large armies across such vast distances while simultaneously fighting the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Colonial loyalist forces, though brave and determined, cannot compensate for inadequate reinforcements and supplies from Spain. The international dimension of the independence wars gradually turns against Spain as other European powers and the United States recognize American republics and provide material support. British merchants, eager to trade directly with American producers rather than through Spanish intermediaries, supply weapons and credit to independence movements. The Monroe Doctrine, 1823, warns European powers against intervening to restore Spanish rule, effectively placing American independence under United States protection. The Battle of Ayacucho on the 9th of December 1824 marks the end of Spanish rule in South America as Antonio Jos de Sucre's forces crush the last major Spanish army. This victory completes the liberation of Peru and effectively ends 3 centuries of Spanish dominance in the Americas. Only the Caribbean islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico remain under Spanish control, along with the distant Philippines. The human and economic costs of the independence wars devastate both Spain and its former colonies. In America, entire regions suffer depopulation as armies conscript men and battles destroy agricultural areas. Silver production collapses as warfare disrupts mining operations and trade networks. Spain loses not only territorial control, but also the colonial wealth that had sustained its European role for centuries. For Spanish America, independence brings both liberation and fragmentation. Bolivar's dream of a united South American confederation dissolves as regional interests override continental solidarity. New nations establish boundaries that often reflect colonial administrative divisions rather than geographic or ethnic realities, creating states that struggle with problems of national integration and economic development. As you drift to sleep in this transformed world, Spanish rule in the Americas has contracted to a few Caribbean islands after controlling territories from California to Chile for over 3 centuries. The independence wars have created numerous republics that must now forge their own identities while dealing with the social and economic legacies of colonial rule. The Spanish Empire has experienced its greatest territorial loss since the conquest, marking the end of Spain's role as a global superpower. You wake in Madrid on the 10th of December, 1898, reading newspaper reports of Spain's humiliating defeat in the Spanish-American War. The Treaty of Paris, signed today, forces Spain to cede the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States while granting independence to Cuba. After 4 centuries of global empire, Spain has been reduced to its European territories, plus scattered African enclaves, marking the effective end of Spanish imperial power. The decades following American independence had seen Spain desperately trying to maintain relevance as a European power while clinging to its remaining colonies. The loss of most American territories eliminated the silver flows that had sustained Spanish influence for centuries, forcing the country to find new sources of wealth and international significance. Morocco becomes the primary focus of Spanish imperial ambitions, but these North African adventures prove costly and largely unsuccessful. Your involvement in Moroccan affairs demonstrates both Spanish pretensions and limitations. The Tetouan War, 1859 to 1860, against Morocco provides a rare military victory that briefly boosts national morale, but the territorial gains prove minimal and expensive to maintain. The Spanish protectorate established over northern Morocco in 1912 becomes a constant drain on resources while providing few tangible benefits beyond satisfying imperial pride. Cuba and the Philippines represent the jewels of your contracted empire, but both colonies increasingly resent Spanish rule and drain metropolitan resources. In Cuba, 3 separate independence wars, 1868 to 1878, 1879 to 1880, 1895 to 1898, demonstrate growing Cuban determination to achieve independence. The final war, led by José Mart and other patriot leaders, develops into a vicious conflict that devastates the island's economy and population. Spanish responses to Cuban rebellion reveal both ruthless determination and strategic incompetence. General Valeriano Weyler's reconcentration policy forces rural Cubans into heavily guarded camps, creating humanitarian disasters that scandalize international opinion while failing to suppress the independence movement. These brutal tactics provide American newspapers with sensational stories that help build United States public support for intervention. The explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor on the 15th of February, 1898, provides the incident that triggers American intervention, though the cause of the explosion remains disputed. American newspapers blame Spain, creating public pressure for war that the McKinley administration cannot resist. Spain, recognizing its military inferiority, attempts diplomatic solutions, but American public opinion has moved beyond compromise. The Spanish-American War reveals the extent of Spanish military decline since the glory days of the Tercios and the Armada. Your fleet, commanded by Admiral Pascual Cervera, knows it faces hopeless odds against modern American warships, but sails to Cuban waters anyway, driven by concepts of honor rather than realistic strategy. The Battle of Santiago Bay, on the 3rd of July, 1898, destroys the entire Spanish squadron in a few hours, demonstrating the technological gap between Spain and emerging world powers. In the Philippines, American forces, commanded by Commodore George Dewey, destroy the Spanish Pacific Fleet at the Battle of Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898, in an even more one-sided engagement. Spanish colonial forces, isolated from reinforcement and facing both American invasion and Filipino independence movements led by Emilio Aguinaldo, cannot mount effective resistance. The loss of the Philippines eliminates Spain's presence in Asia after over 3 centuries. The domestic impact of these defeats traumatizes Spanish society and triggers intense national introspection. The generation of 98, including writers like Miguel de Unamuno and Ram del Valle Inclán, examines Spanish decadence and searches for ways to regenerate national culture. The military defeat reveals broader problems: economic backwardness, political corruption, social inequality, and intellectual isolation from European developments. Spanish colonial administration in the remaining territories attempts modest reforms, but these prove too little and too late. In Morocco, the disaster at Annual in 1921, where Rif fighters massacre an entire Spanish army, demonstrates continued military incompetence and triggers political crises that contribute to the dictatorship of Miguel Primo de Rivera, 1923 to 1930. Colonial wars continue draining Spanish resources, while providing few benefits. The Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, temporarily interrupts decolonization as the country tears itself apart in ideological conflict. Francisco Franco's victory establishes a dictatorship that attempts to revive imperial rhetoric while lacking the power to sustain imperial commitments. Franco's Spain maintains colonies in Africa, but increasingly sees them as burdens rather than assets. World War II exposes Spanish weakness, despite Franco's attempts to remain neutral while supporting Axis powers. Hitler's demand for Spanish entry into the war reveals that Spain possesses little strategic value. Its colonial empire is negligible, its military forces are obsolete, and its economy remains predominantly agricultural. The meeting between Franco and Hitler at Hendaye demonstrates Spanish irrelevance in great power politics. The decolonization process accelerates after World War II as international opinion increasingly opposes colonial rule, while Spain lacks the military and economic resources to maintain unwilling territories. Morocco gains independence in 1956, eliminating Spain's most important remaining colonial possession. Equatorial Guinea follows in 1968, leaving Spain with only scattered enclaves in North Africa. The Sahara crisis of the 1970 seconds represents Spain's final imperial moment as Moroccan and Mauritanian pressure, combined with Polisario independence movements and international condemnation, forces Spanish withdrawal from Spanish Sahara, now Western Sahara, in 1975. This abandonment, occurring in the same year as Franco's death, marks the definitive end of Spanish colonial empire. Your economic development during these final imperial decades reveals the transformation from colonial to modern European economy. The loss of colonial wealth forces Spain to develop domestic industry and agriculture rather than depending on imperial resources. This process, though painful, ultimately creates more sustainable economic foundations than the colonial wealth that had encouraged centuries of dependence on external resources. As you fall asleep in this post-imperial Spain, Spanish territory has contracted to its European boundaries, plus a few North African enclaves, Ceuta and Melilla, that remain Spanish cities rather than colonies. The empire that once spanned 4 continents has returned to its Iberian origins, but the cultural, linguistic, and institutional legacies of 4 centuries of global rule continue shaping dozens of nations throughout the Americas, Africa, and Asia. You wake in Madrid on the 20th of November, 1975, watching Francisco Franco's death end not only his 4-decade dictatorship, but also the final chapter of Spanish imperial history. The Spain emerging from authoritarianism must confront its colonial past while building democratic institutions and integrating into modern Europe. This reckoning with imperial legacy reveals both the enduring influence of Spanish colonialism and the complex challenges facing post-imperial nations. The Spanish language represents perhaps the most visible legacy of your former empire. Today, Spanish is spoken by over 500 million people worldwide, making it the second most spoken language by native speakers. From Mexico to Argentina, from the Philippines to Equatorial Guinea, Spanish serves as an official language in nations spanning multiple continents. The linguistic unity created by imperial expansion now facilitates cultural and economic connections that transcend political boundaries. But this linguistic legacy also reflects the violent cultural transformation that accompanied Spanish colonization. Indigenous languages throughout the Americas declined dramatically under Spanish rule, with dozens of languages disappearing entirely. The survivors often exist in fragmented form, spoken primarily by marginalized communities who lack political and economic power. Spanish linguistic dominance represents both successful imperial administration and cultural destruction on a continental scale. The Catholic Church's role in Spanish colonization created religious patterns that persist throughout former Spanish territories. Latin America remains predominantly Catholic, with religious practices that blend European Christian traditions with indigenous and African elements. Colonial missions established educational and social welfare systems that continued operating long after independence, creating institutional continuities that shape contemporary society. However, the Church's colonial role also involved systematic destruction of indigenous religious traditions and forced conversion of millions. Archaeological evidence reveals the extent to which Spanish colonizers demolished pre-Columbian religious sites, using the stones to build Catholic churches as deliberate symbols of spiritual conquest. Contemporary liberation theology movements within Latin American Catholicism often critique these colonial legacies while working for social justice. Legal systems throughout Spanish America demonstrate both continuity and adaptation of colonial institutions. The Siete Partidas and other Spanish legal codes provided foundations for post-independence legal development, creating similarities in legal traditions from Mexico to Chile. Property rights, family law, and administrative procedures often reflect colonial Spanish precedents adapted to local conditions. Yet these legal continuities also embedded colonial inequalities within post-independence legal systems. Land ownership patterns established during colonization often persisted after independence, maintaining concentrated ownership that originated in colonial encomienda grants and hacienda development. Legal distinctions based on race, though formally abolished, continue influencing social relations in ways that reflect colonial hierarchies. Urban planning throughout former Spanish America reveals the persistence of colonial spatial organization. The laws of the Indies required colonial cities to follow specific patterns centered on a main plaza surrounded by cathedral, government buildings, and elite residences. This urban form, replicated from San Antonio to Santiago, creates visual continuities that reflect shared colonial experience while adapting to diverse local conditions. Economic structures, established during colonization, continue influencing development patterns in former Spanish territories. Many Latin American nations remain primary commodity exporters, shipping raw materials to industrial nations in exchange for manufactured goods. This pattern, established during centuries of colonial rule when American territories supplied silver and agricultural products to European markets, has proven difficult to transform. The social hierarchies created by Spanish colonization persist in modified form throughout Latin America. While legal equality has replaced formal caste systems, social stratification often correlates with racial categories inherited from colonial society. European-descended elites frequently maintain disproportionate political and economic power, while indigenous and Afro-descendant populations face ongoing discrimination and marginalization. Educational institutions founded during the colonial period continue operating throughout Spanish America, though with transformed missions and curricula. The University of Mexico, 1551, and University of San Marcos in Lima, 1551, predate most European universities, demonstrating Spanish commitment to establishing educational institutions in colonial territories. These universities now serve as centers for studying colonial history and its contemporary implications. Spain's relationship with former colonies has evolved from imperial domination through mutual neglect to contemporary partnership based on shared cultural heritage. The Organization of Ibero-American States promotes cooperation in education, culture, and development while respecting national sovereignty. Spanish companies have invested heavily in Latin American telecommunications, banking, and energy sectors, creating economic relationships that some critics describe as neo-colonial. Contemporary migration patterns reveal ongoing connections between Spain and former colonies. Economic difficulties in Latin America have driven millions to seek opportunities in Spain, while Spanish emigrants during the Franco era often settled in Argentina, Venezuela, and other Spanish-speaking countries. These migration flows create transnational communities that maintain cultural and family connections across former imperial boundaries. Spanish cultural production increasingly confronts colonial legacies through film, literature, and art. Directors like Alejandro Amenbar and writers like Antonio Muoz Molina explore colonial themes, while contemporary Latin American authors like Mario Vargas Llosa and Carlos Fuentes examine colonialism's enduring effects. These cultural works contribute to broader conversations about historical memory and contemporary responsibility. The quincentennial of Columbus's voyage in 1992 triggered intense debates about how to commemorate colonial history. While some celebrated the encounter of two worlds and Hispanic cultural achievements, indigenous and progressive groups emphasized conquest, exploitation, and cultural destruction. These debates continue shaping historical education and public memory throughout the Hispanic world. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing new information about colonial society and its impact on indigenous populations. Excavations of colonial cities, missions, and indigenous settlements provide evidence about daily life, cultural adaptation, and resistance that supplements written historical sources. This archaeological record often reveals gaps between official colonial policies and local realities. As you drift to sleep in contemporary Spain, now a prosperous European democracy, the country has successfully transitioned from imperial power to modern nation-state. But throughout the Americas, Africa, and Asia, the legacies of 4 centuries of Spanish rule continue shaping political, economic, social, and cultural development. The Spanish Empire has ended, but its influence on world history remains profound and persistent. You wake in El Ain, Spanish Sahara, on the 14th of November 1975, watching Spanish officials prepare to abandon the last significant territory of an empire that once spanned 4 continents. The Green March 200, unarmed Moroccan civilians walking into the disputed territory has created an impossible situation for Spain's dying dictator, Francisco Franco, and his weakened colonial administration. Within days, Spain will abandon Western Sahara, effectively ending 4.5 centuries of overseas empire. The Spanish Sahara, acquired gradually through treaties with local tribes, beginning in 1884, had never been a profitable colony. The vast desert territory, larger than Britain, contained fewer than 100,000 people, mostly nomadic Sahrawi tribes, who had little interest in European-style government. Spanish administration remained minimal. A few coastal settlements, some military posts, and Catholic missions that made few converts among the Muslim population. But the discovery of phosphate deposits at Bukra in the 1960 seconds suddenly made Spanish Sahara valuable. The high-quality phosphate rock could supply Spain's agricultural needs while providing export revenues. Spanish companies invested in mining infrastructure, building a 100-kilometre conveyor belt to transport phosphate to the coast, one of the longest such systems in the world. For the first time in decades, a Spanish colony showed promise of generating significant wealth. However, the wave of decolonization sweeping Africa in the 1960 seconds had reached Spain's doorstep. Morocco, independent since 1956, claimed the Sahara as part of its historical territory, arguing that Sahrawi tribes had traditionally paid tribute to Moroccan sultans. Algeria supported the Polisario Front, a Sahrawi independence movement that began guerrilla attacks against Spanish forces in 1973. The United Nations called for decolonization through self-determination, putting international pressure on Spain to withdraw. Your experience in Spanish Morocco's northern zone from 1956 provides context for understanding Spain's colonial limitations. Despite controlling this territory for over 4 decades, Spanish influence had remained largely superficial. Most Moroccans continued following traditional social and economic patterns, while Spanish administrators and soldiers lived in isolated enclaves with minimal local contact. When Morocco demanded independence, Spain possessed neither the military power nor the political will to resist. In Equatorial Guinea, Spain's only sub-Saharan African colony, you witness another example of late colonial failure. The small territory, consisting of the island of Fernando Po, now Bioko, and the mainland enclave of Ro Muni, had been a neglected backwater throughout most of the colonial period. Cocoa plantations on Fernando Po provided modest revenues, but the territory required constant subsidies from Spain. The rapid decolonization of Equatorial Guinea in 1968 demonstrates Spanish unpreparedness for managing imperial withdrawal. Francisco Macazanguema, the independence leader who becomes the first president, quickly establishes one of Africa's most brutal dictatorships. Spanish colonists flee en masse as political persecution and economic collapse devastate the newly independent nation. Spain's colonial legacy in Equatorial Guinea becomes one of abandonment and subsequent tragedy. The IFNI War, 1957 to 1958, reveals Spain's military weakness even in defending its remaining territories. Moroccan irregular forces, supported by the Moroccan government, attack Spanish positions in the small enclave of Ifni. Despite eventually maintaining control, Spanish forces require French military assistance to defeat poorly equipped tribal fighters. The war exposes how far Spanish military capabilities have declined since the imperial height. Franco's regime attempts to maintain imperial rhetoric while lacking imperial substance. Spanish propaganda continues celebrating the discovery of America and Spain's civilizing mission. But these claims ring hollow when Spain cannot defend small African territories against regional powers. The regime's autarkic economic policies isolate Spain from international markets, while former colonies develop new relationships with other nations. The economic burden of maintaining colonial territories increasingly outweighs any benefits they provide. Spanish Sahara requires constant subsidies for administration and defense while generating minimal revenues beyond phosphate exports. The small Spanish garrison faces growing Polisario attacks, while international opinion increasingly opposes colonial rule in any form. Hassan II of Morocco's decision to organize the Green March represents a masterstroke of political theatre that Spain cannot counter. By sending unarmed civilians rather than soldiers into Spanish Sahara, Morocco creates a situation where Spanish resistance would appear as violence against peaceful protesters. The march receives extensive international media coverage, transforming a territorial dispute into a human rights issue that favours Moroccan claims. Spain's response reveals the paralysis affecting Franco's regime in its final months. The dictator, dying of various illnesses, cannot make decisive policy while his subordinates fear taking responsibility for major decisions. Spanish military commanders in the Sahara request permission to use force against the marchers, but receive conflicting instructions from Madrid. The resulting confusion allows Morocco to achieve its goals through peaceful invasion. The Madrid Accords, signed on the 14th of November, 1975, represent Spain's final act of imperial retreat. Under pressure from Morocco, Mauritania, and the United Nations, Spain agrees to withdraw from Western Sahara and transfer administration to Morocco and Mauritania. This agreement abandons the Sahrawi people's right to self-determination while avoiding the military confrontation that Spain cannot afford. Your departure from El Ain symbolizes the end of Spanish overseas empire in a way that contrasts sharply with the glorious conquests of previous centuries. No treasure fleets carry wealth back to Spain. No triumphant armies return laden with glory. Instead, Spanish administrators quietly pack their files, while soldiers dismantle military installations. The last Spanish flag lowered over colonial territory receives no ceremonial fanfare. The aftermath of Spanish withdrawal creates the ongoing Western Sahara conflict that continues today. The Polisario Front, abandoned by Spain and opposed by Morocco, begins a guerrilla war that displaces thousands of Sahrawis to refugee camps in Algeria. Morocco's occupation of most Western Sahara territory creates a frozen conflict that demonstrates the complications arising from Spain's imperial legacy. Franco's death on the 20th of November, 1975, just days after the Spanish withdrawal from the Sahara, marks the symbolic end of both dictatorship and empire. The coincidence seems historically appropriate. The regime that had attempted to maintain imperial pretensions dies with the abandonment of the last significant colonial territory. Spain enters its democratic transition freed from colonial burdens, but also stripped of any remaining claims to global influence. The enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla, captured during the 15th century expansion into Morocco, remain Spanish territory, but represent persistence rather than expansion. These small cities, surrounded by Moroccan territory, survive because of their strategic value and because their populations prefer Spanish to Moroccan rule. They constitute the final remnants of 5 centuries of Spanish presence in Africa. Spanish Guinea's transformation into Equatorial Guinea provides a cautionary tale about rapid decolonization. Francisco Macaz Nguema's dictatorship, 1968 to 1979, destroys the territory's economy and infrastructure while persecuting Spanish residents and educated Africans. His nephew Teodoro Obiang's continuing rule since 1979 perpetuates authoritarian government, while Spanish colonial influence fades into irrelevance. The contrast between Spanish decolonization and British or French withdrawal reveals significant differences in imperial capabilities and colonial development. While Britain and France maintained extensive economic and military relationships with former colonies, Spain lacked the resources to sustain such connections. Spanish withdrawal more closely resembled abandonment than managed transition to independence. As you board the final Spanish ship, leaving El Ain harbour, watching the Saharan coast disappear into the distance, you witness the conclusion of one of history's longest-lasting empires. The Spanish Empire, which began with Columbus's voyage in 1492 and reached its territorial peak in the 18th century, has finally contracted to its European boundaries. The age of Spanish global dominance has definitively ended. You wake in Mexico City on the 12th of October, 2024, participating in Dia de la Raza, celebrations that reveal how Spanish colonial legacy continues shaping cultural identity 5 centuries after Columbus's voyage. The complex reactions to this commemoration, some celebrating Hispanic heritage, while others condemn colonial exploitation, demonstrate the ongoing relevance of Spanish imperial history in contemporary world affairs. The Spanish language represents the most visible and enduring legacy of your former empire. Over 500 million people speak Spanish worldwide, making it the second most spoken language by native speakers after Mandarin Chinese. From the United States, where Spanish speakers will comprise 30% of the population by 2050, to the Philippines, where Spanish influence persists in local languages, your linguistic empire continues expanding, even as political empire has vanished. But this linguistic dominance masks the destruction of hundreds of indigenous languages during colonial rule. In Mexico alone, over 150 indigenous languages were spoken before the conquest. Today, many survive only in fragmented form among marginalized communities. The Spanish language's triumph represents both successful imperial administration and one of history's largest episodes of linguistic genocide. The Catholic Church's colonial legacy creates similarly complex patterns throughout former Spanish territories. Latin America remains the world's most Catholic region, with over 400 million believers maintaining religious practices that blend European Christianity with indigenous and African traditions. Colonial churches and cathedrals from Mexico to Peru still serve as centers of community life, while displaying architectural styles that fused European Baroque with local artistic traditions. Yet contemporary liberation theology movements within Latin American Catholicism increasingly critique the Church's colonial role in supporting Spanish domination and suppressing indigenous spirituality. Base communities and indigenous Catholic movements work to decolonize religious practice while maintaining Christian faith, creating new syntheses that honor both Catholic and pre-Columbian spiritual traditions. Educational institutions founded during colonial rule continue operating throughout Spanish America, though with dramatically transformed missions. The Universidad de San Marcos in Lima, 1551, and Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, 1551, now rank among Latin America's leading research universities while offering programs in indigenous languages and post-colonial studies that examine their own colonial origins. The quincentennial of Columbus's voyage in 1992 triggered intense international debate about how to commemorate colonial history. Spain's government promoted the Encounter of Two Worlds theme, emphasizing cultural exchange and Hispanic achievements, while minimizing conquest and exploitation. However, indigenous movements throughout the Americas used the anniversary to highlight ongoing discrimination and demand recognition of colonial genocide. Contemporary migration patterns reveal persistent connections between Spain and former colonies that transcend political boundaries. Economic crises in Latin America during the 1980 seconds and 2000 seconds drove millions to seek opportunities in Spain, creating vibrant immigrant communities in Madrid, Barcelona, and other Spanish cities. These migrants maintain transnational identities while contributing to Spanish economic growth and cultural diversity. Spanish companies have invested heavily in Latin American telecommunications, banking, and energy sectors since the 1990 seconds, creating economic relationships that critics describe as neo-colonial. Telefónica, Santander, Iberdrola, and other Spanish multinationals operate throughout Latin America, while Spanish construction companies have built infrastructure projects from Mexico to Chile. These investments generate profits for Spain, while providing capital and technology for Latin American development. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing new information about colonial society and indigenous resistance that challenges traditional historical narratives. Excavations in Mexico, Peru, and other former Spanish territories uncover evidence of cultural persistence, adaptation, and resistance among indigenous communities. These findings contribute to more nuanced understandings of colonial experience that recognize indigenous agency alongside Spanish domination. The digital age has created new possibilities for cultural connection across former imperial boundaries. Spanish-language internet content, streaming services, and social media platforms connect Spanish speakers worldwide, while facilitating cultural exchange that transcends national borders. Spanish-language literature, film, and music circulate globally through networks that reflect historical imperial connections, while serving contemporary cultural interests. Legal systems throughout Spanish America demonstrate continuing colonial influence adapted to modern conditions. Civil law traditions derived from Spanish colonial codes still shape legal practice from Mexico to Argentina. Property rights, family law, and commercial regulations often reflect colonial precedents, though modified by republican constitutions and international human rights standards. Urban planning in former Spanish colonial cities reveals the persistence of laws of the Indies spatial organization. Central plazas surrounded by cathedrals and government buildings remain focal points of civic life from San Antonio to Santiago. Colonial architectural styles continue influencing contemporary construction, while historic preservation efforts maintain colonial-era buildings as symbols of cultural heritage. Contemporary art and literature throughout the Hispanic world increasingly engage with colonial themes, examining both the trauma of conquest and the creativity of cultural synthesis. Authors like Mario Vargas Llosa, Carlos Fuentes, and Roberto Bolaño explore colonial legacies, while filmmakers and visual artists create works that examine ongoing colonial influences on contemporary society. The Organization of Ibero-American States, founded in 1991, institutionalizes cooperation between Spain, Portugal, and their former American colonies. While respecting national sovereignty, the organization promotes collaboration in education, culture, and development that builds on shared linguistic and cultural heritage. Regular summit meetings bring together heads of state and government to discuss common challenges and opportunities. Spain's relationship with the Philippines reveals different patterns of post-colonial connection. Spanish rule ended in 1898, but cultural influences persist in Filipino architecture, cuisine, and religious practice. However, American colonization, 1898 to 1946, and the adoption of English as an official language have weakened Spanish cultural connections compared to Latin America. Climate change and environmental degradation create new challenges that span former imperial boundaries. Deforestation in the Amazon, mining pollution in the Andes, and coastal erosion throughout the Caribbean require international cooperation that often follows networks established during colonial rule. Spanish environmental organizations work with Latin American counterparts on conservation projects that reflect shared ecological heritage. As you drift to sleep in this interconnected Hispanic world, Spanish cultural influence continues expanding through education, media, and migration, even as Spain has long ceased to be a global political power. The Spanish Empire ended with decolonization, but Spanish civilization persists as a transnational cultural system that shapes the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people across multiple continents. You wake one final time, not in any specific place or moment, but in the realm of historical reflection, contemplating the extraordinary arc of the Spanish Empire across 4.5 centuries. From the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabel in 1469 to the abandonment of Western Sahara in 1975, you have witnessed one of history's most dramatic stories of rise, dominance, and decline. A tale that offers profound lessons about human ambition, cultural contact, and the limits of imperial power. The Spanish Empire's origins reveal how historical circumstances can amplify human ambitions far beyond their original scope. Ferdinand and Isabel's goal was simply unifying Iberia and completing the Reconquista against Muslim Granada. Columbus sought a western route to Asia to compete with Portuguese expansion around Africa. Cortes and Pizarro pursued personal wealth and glory through New World adventures. None imagined they were creating the first global empire, yet their individual decisions combined to reshape world history. The speed and scope of Spanish expansion demonstrate both human audacity and indigenous vulnerability to Old World diseases and technology. Within 50 years of Columbus's voyage, Spanish rule extended from California to Chile, encompassing territories larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. This expansion succeeded not only through Spanish courage and superior military technology, but also through demographic catastrophe among Native American populations who lacked immunity to European diseases. The wealth generated by Spanish America, particularly Potos's silver, created the first truly global economy while revealing the economic paradoxes of empire. Spanish silver connected Asia, Europe, Africa, and America through trade networks of unprecedented scope and complexity. Chinese merchants accepted Spanish reales, European prices inflated due to American precious metals, and African slaves were purchased with New World wealth. Yet Spain itself, despite controlling this global system, repeatedly faced bankruptcy because imperial expenses exceeded even extraordinary colonial revenues. The cultural legacies of Spanish colonization created lasting patterns that transcend political independence. The Spanish language, Catholic Christianity, legal traditions, urban planning, and social hierarchies established during colonial rule continue shaping societies throughout Latin America. These cultural transfers represent both successful imperial administration and profound disruption of indigenous ways of life. The synthesis of European, indigenous, and African elements created distinctive colonial cultures that persist in modified form today. The administrative challenges of governing a global empire reveal the practical limitations of pre-modern government. Communication between Madrid and Manila required over a year, making coordinated policy implementation impossible. Colonial officials operated with minimal supervision, leading to corruption, inefficiency, and local conflicts that central authorities could not quickly resolve. The empire's vast scale created coordination problems that even the most sophisticated colonial bureaucracy could not effectively manage. The military aspects of Spanish imperial expansion and defense demonstrate how technological advantages can be temporary, while strategic overextension proves fatal. Spanish conquistadors succeeded initially because horses, steel weapons, and gunpowder provided decisive advantages over indigenous forces. But other European powers quickly adopted similar technologies, while Spain's global commitments exceeded its defensive capabilities. The empire that conquered through superior military organization ultimately collapsed because it attempted to defend too much territory against too many enemies. The religious dimension of Spanish imperialism reveals both the power of ideological motivation and the contradictions of converting through conquest. Spanish colonizers genuinely believed they were bringing Christian salvation to pagan peoples while creating temporal empire. This religious motivation provided psychological justification for conquest, while inspiring architectural, educational, and artistic achievements throughout Spanish America. Yet forced conversion and the destruction of indigenous religious traditions created spiritual violence that undermined Christianity's evangelical message. The social hierarchies created by Spanish colonization established patterns of inequality that persist in various forms throughout Latin America. The encomienda system, racial caste categories, and concentrated land ownership generated wealth for Spanish and Creole elites, while marginalizing indigenous and African-descended populations. Though legal equality replaced formal caste systems after independence, social stratification often continues correlating with racial categories inherited from colonial society. The economic structure of Spanish colonialism, extracting raw materials from America for processing in Europe, while selling manufactured goods back to colonial markets, established dependency relationships that many scholars argue continue shaping global economic patterns. Contemporary Latin American countries remain primarily commodity exporters despite centuries of independence, suggesting that colonial economic structures prove remarkably persistent even after political decolonization. The independence movements that dismembered the Spanish Empire demonstrate how Enlightenment ideas about popular sovereignty and natural rights could be turned against imperial rule by colonial elites educated in European intellectual traditions. Creole leaders like Bolivar and San Martin used Spanish educational institutions to learn political theories that justified rebellion against Spanish authority. The empire's cultural success in creating educated colonial elites ultimately provided the intellectual foundation for independence movements. The Spanish Empire's gradual decline over 3 centuries, rather than sudden collapse, illustrates how empires can persist long after losing their essential vitality. Spanish rule continued in Cuba and the Philippines until 1898, despite losing most American territories by 1825. The empire's longevity resulted from institutional momentum, local elite cooperation, and the absence of immediate alternatives rather than any renewal of imperial strength or legitimacy. The final phase of Spanish decolonization in Africa during the 1950 seconds and 1970 seconds reveals how changing international norms about colonialism made empire impossible to sustain regardless of local conditions. Spain abandoned Western Sahara, not because of military defeat, but because international opinion no longer accepted colonial rule as legitimate. The empire that began with papal authorization ended when global consensus rejected imperial domination as fundamentally unjust. The contemporary relevance of Spanish imperial history extends far beyond academic study. Understanding how the Spanish Empire operated provides insights into current globalization processes, cultural exchange, migration patterns, and international economic relationships. The networks established during Spanish rule continue facilitating connections between Spain and Latin America, while the cultural synthesis achieved during colonization offers models for managing diversity in multicultural societies. The Spanish Empire's story ultimately reveals both human potential and human limitations. Spanish explorers, conquistadors, missionaries, and administrators achieved remarkable feats of navigation, military conquest, cultural adaptation, and institutional creation. They connected previously isolated continents, facilitated unprecedented cultural exchange, and created architectural and artistic works of enduring beauty. Yet these achievements occurred through processes that included devastating warfare, cultural destruction, demographic catastrophe, and systematic exploitation. As you reflect on this epic journey from medieval Iberian kingdoms to global empire and back to European nation-state, the Spanish experience offers sobering lessons about the costs and consequences of imperial ambition. The empire that brought Christianity to millions also destroyed indigenous religions. The system that created Baroque cathedrals and magnificent cities also killed millions through warfare, disease, and exploitation. The networks that connected global trade also facilitated the Atlantic slave trade. Perhaps the most important lesson from Spanish imperial history concerns the relationship between power and responsibility. Spain possessed unprecedented global power for over 2 centuries, but often used that power in ways that prioritized immediate advantage over long-term consequences. The environmental destruction, cultural disruption, and social inequality generated by Spanish colonization continue affecting societies throughout the former empire centuries after political independence. Yet the Spanish Empire also demonstrates human capacity for cultural creativity, institutional innovation, and cross-cultural adaptation. The distinctive societies created throughout Spanish America represent remarkable syntheses of European, indigenous, and African elements. Colonial architecture, cuisine, music, and religious practices often transcended their individual components to create something genuinely new and beautiful. The Spanish Empire's cultural achievements remind us that even systems built through conquest and maintained through exploitation can generate works of lasting human value. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through 4.5 centuries of Spanish imperial history. From the union of Castile and Aragon to the abandonment of Western Sahara, we have witnessed one of humanity's most extraordinary stories of expansion, achievement, and ultimate retreat. The Spanish Empire reshaped the world in ways we still experience today, creating connections, conflicts, and cultural patterns that continue influencing global affairs. If you found this epic tale of conquest and empire fascinating, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the great stories of world history. The Rise and Fall of Empires offers timeless lessons about human ambition, cultural exchange, and the complex relationships between power and responsibility that remain relevant in our interconnected modern world. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, history is always closer than we think.